Hey friends, good to be with you guys today. Yes, I have completely shaved my head. This is a result of quarantine. We do what we can. But today's scripture reading comes from Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pick up what is planted. A time to kill, and a time to heal. A time to break down, and a time to build up. A time to weep, and a time to laugh. A time to mourn, and a time to dance. A time to throw away stones, and it's time to gather stones together. A time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. A time to seek, and a time to lose. A time to keep, and a time to throw away. A time to tear, and a time to sow. A time to keep silence, and a time to speak. A time for love, and a time for hate. A time for war, and a time for peace. This is the word of God. What time is it now? No, wait, really? Can someone please tell me what time? I think it's Tuesday. I'm not quite sure. Been a long week. Who knows? Jokes aside, it really does seem like that time as we normally know it, the sort of rhythmic times of our daily lives and patterns and purposes are beyond distorted. Ecclesiastes 3 is one of the more well-known passages in the book because of the infamous long list of antithesis statements that we have all experienced in one way or another. This passage has been read in many ways for many different situations in life. Read at its best, I think it provides a sense of comfort for grief and an understanding of the chaotic seasons of life. But in the hands of the fatalist, it may encourage a reality they cannot escape, abandoning hope altogether. But the awesome splendor that captivated many early Christian writers was the idea of predestination. Predestination can be thought of as the complete subordination of all ways of life and issues of destiny to the sovereign will of God. So let's say we read Ecclesiastes 3 with a predestination lens. To me, it implies that God's wisdom is sort of an unfolding, set-in-stone thing rather than a constantly working force, working with and through humanity effectively. That is why the question we need to ask ourselves in this time of quarantine and isolation and fleeting hope, feeling like fatalists ourselves, is how do we understand our wisdom versus God's wisdom? What is it time to do now, in these days? So a couple years ago, I was working as a youth intern at a church called Independent Presbyterian in Birmingham, Alabama. Part of my responsibilities was planning Sunday school each week. And one week, a man who worked as a professor at Birmingham Southern, who attended the church, he liked to help out with Sunday school about once a year. And boy, did his once-a-year Sunday school lessons really stick. His lesson this Sunday was on God's wisdom, and it was a lesson that has influenced me to this day. He started out by asking the kids to write down what it means to have knowledge versus what it means to have wisdom. You'd get these pretty classic high school responses such as, knowledge is like book smarts, while wisdom is like street smarts. Or you might get, knowledge is knowing what to do, and wisdom is knowing when to do it. All great, justifiable answers in their own right, but he wanted to push the envelope a little farther. So then he presented a couple ethical dilemmas. You know, the classic scenario of You're going on a train down a train track. One side has one person stuck while the other has 5 people. Of course, there is a debate, but people usually side with saving the 5 people, right? The sort of saving more lives. But then he pushed the envelope even farther to make it a little more personal. He said, imagine your 5-year-old son runs down to hear the train coming by, and in doing so he gets his leg stuck in the tracks. And then in a panic, your husband or wife goes down to try and get him, also getting stuck in the track. The train is coming. What do you do? Who do you save? If you're thinking to yourself, what? This is a Sunday school sermon for middle and high schoolers? That's a little bonkers. Then you'd be thinking exactly what I was thinking at the time. After some attempts to think through an answer by the kids and justify something in this horrible, ungodly scenario, the professor finally chimed in, and this is what he said. Sometimes life presents us with messy, horrible, ungodly situations that we do not know how to handle or we do not know how to fix, no matter how bad we want to try. God's wisdom is beyond our own. God's wisdom is outside of our control and knowledge. It was an eye-opening message to the kids and myself, and it has been an idea I've wrestled with since. I can understand things happening out of our control. I mean, it essentially happens every day of our lives. More of our life is out of control than we think. But was he in some way suggesting that God was an active agent in this? Was God doing this on purpose? Does God pick and choose these awful things to happen? These are questions I see certain groups of Christians even claiming now in our time of global pandemic. Did we do something to deserve this? Is God punishing us for our sin? We must have done something wrong. But I want to say no to these people. I want to say that God is not a God of retribution. But if it is not retribution, then what is this God's wisdom? Well, perhaps the list of opposites we see in Ecclesiastes 3 can help us think about this. Where have you seen Ecclesiastes 3, verses 1 through 8? Maybe a funeral, or maybe it was used in a pastoral care setting to console someone who is hurting or someone who is recently lost. What I'm getting at is that our first reaction in reading this text is usually always read subjectively. We apply the aspects of this text to certain times in our own life, to be happy and enjoy the good times, and to give solace when mourning. It all rings true to us. What might be helpful to us as pastors in this time is to not only use this text for its subjective uses, but to think about what it might say about God's point of view, or might we say from God's wisdom. What I mean by this is when we experience any range of experiences on this spectrum presented in Ecclesiastes, it locates us at one time, at a particular time. On a subjective level, we can all think of a time when it was a time to speak out, or a time to be silent, or a time to mourn, or a time to dance. But this is how we view time and experience. How does God? Does God not experience these things all at once? Perhaps God is our cosmic caretaker, our cosmic playground. We may be for a season, but God is always present, always happening, always being. That is why I believe God hurts with us. Our pain is God's pain, and our joy is God's joy. A wisdom that is wider and greater than our own. Last week in our Song of Songs Exegesis class, we looked at several pieces of artwork, one of them being by a sculptor named Henry Moore. He is known for doing these gigantic sculptures that force you to take it in from different perspectives. If you are up close, you may only be able to see a quarter of the piece. The only way you can take it all in is if you actually are much farther away, say from an aerial view. We did this to highlight the idea of perspective. Sometimes it is important for us to take a step back, view the picture as a whole rather just in tiny pieces. Perhaps this is what Ecclesiastes is calling us to do. Our perspective and subjectivity can often lead us to thinking that we are in control, or that our thoughts and experiences prevail and are more important than others. We should go ahead and reopen Georgia, because it's not going to hurt anyone, right? I'll be fine. I have enough. Or are we called to actually try and step into God's perspective? To look at the world and realize that pain, suffering, happiness, and joy is happening all at once. But to who? Which groups of people? To me, this is exactly what much of the wisdom literature is trying to do. How can we somehow tap into God's perspective, God's wisdom? It is the struggle that I'm sure the teacher in Ecclesiastes was facing themselves. Is life meaningless and fleeting? Or is there some beauty in this perspective? Is there more to life than death? But that is the thing about wisdom, especially how we see wisdom in Proverbs. Wisdom is something that is always out in front of us, something out of reach, yet we yearn for, something that we strive to obtain. But as Proverbs 2 shows us, it's something that we can only receive as a gift, which to me means we still have to be open and searching and willing to receive these small gifts. Is now a time to withdraw into ourselves and our fear? Or is now the time to grow into God's perspective? I believe when we do this, when we attempt to grow and search for God's wisdom, it helps spread the burden and pain that we and our communities are feeling. It is when we hold so rigidly to our own perspectives and ideas and experiences that we feel alone and we suffer. Is this not the wisdom we see in the book of Job? God tells Job that you are suffering. I am with you, but I am also with all of creation. I'm trying to take it in all at once. God's wisdom may be unknown to us, but God's presence is always with us. And when we continue to long for God and God's wisdom, we transform ourselves and consequently our communities, because wisdom is an embodied thing, not necessarily an intellectual one. Wisdom comes into the body and it transforms us. God's wisdom may always be outside of our control and knowledge, but I believe when we are hurting and suffering, God is suffering with us. When we find times to celebrate and sow the ground, God is also praising and celebrating with us. I'm not sure what time it is now, but perhaps if we take a step back and try to look through God's lens, not our own lens, we can see the work that needs to be done. We can start aiding the communities that are suffering, and we can celebrate the small victories with our loved ones. I hope that we can keep searching and listening to God during these times and not be afraid to live into the ways God's wisdom is transforming us. Listen and be open to the needs of our communities, and remember to side with the least of these. Our wisdom is not God's wisdom, but search for it as a gift. Carry the light of God's love and presence with you today. We may be weeping and mourning now, friends, but soon enough it will be time to laugh and dance again. We cannot embrace now, but there will be a time to embrace again. Amen.